Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to The Heartbeat, the place where I talk about just a few of the things that make this little guy tick. Today, I'm going to be talking about Ron Howard's In the Heart of the Sea. Join me, won't you? So, set in the 1820s, In the Heart of the Sea details the real-life events that inspire the fictional novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And actually, Mr. Melville does appear in this film, kind of in this flash-forward sequence that kind of runs throughout the piece, as he seeks out material for that novel by interviewing this ex-whaleman who is from the famed ship the Essex Nantucket. And the rest of the film takes place on that ship, as that crew kind of goes from being hunters of the whales to being hunted by them, one of which actually destroys their ship and kind of forces them on this harrowing journey home. Now, as I mentioned before, Mr. Ron Howard is behind the camera here and is crafting yet again another story that really demonstrates his interest in pushing man to their limits. So whether it's the speed in Rush, or finances in Cinderella Man, or sanity in A Beautiful Mind, or fire in Backdraft, or outer space in Apollo 13, or the sea in the Heart of the Sea. And in each of those instances, Mr. Howard really does love exploring the external forces that push man to the edge, and then what becomes of them when they get there. And for this film, I do like that, conceptually anyways, and it has worked really well for Mr. Howard in the past on A Beautiful Mind or Apollo 13, and it's also worked really well for Robert Zemeckis on Castaway or Ang Lee on Life of Pi. And in execution, I thought there were elements of this film that could be acceptably compared to those films. So the actors, I thought, really all threw themselves wholeheartedly into their roles. We had Chris Hemsworth leading the way with his endless charisma and hardened gruffness. I mean, you just look at the guy and think, yeah, he could survive at sea and take on a whale. And I also thought Brendan Gleeson, who played the older whaleman who's recounting the story to Mr. Melville, turned in a really solid performance as a man tortured by guilt and shame. And Cillian Murphy and Tom Holland both did fine jobs with the material that they were given. And tied directly to those performances, I find that by and large, Mr. Howard's way of directing actors tends to be rather loose and naturalistic. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of simultaneous dialogue as well as kind of fun hijinks that run throughout. And not only does that infuse the film with a bit more reality, but also a bit more of a unique personality and life. And that was definitely something I found to be the case on another of Mr. Howard's recent films, Frost Nixon. I did also feel like I could see Mr. Howard's hand positively influencing a few of the visual elements in the film. So for instance, I've noticed on a lot of his work, and especially in Frost Nixon and the truly embarrassing Da Vinci Code films, that he really loves to kind of capture the fragmented way that our brain kind of perceives and processes the world around us. And the way that he does this is kind of this really fast intercutting between these different close-ups of the surrounding environment. And though it was interesting on the aforementioned films, I felt like it made a lot more sense and worked a lot better on In the Heart of the Sea, as it really captured well the textured, gritty reality of this world that these sailors lived in with all its sights and sounds. With that too, Howard's talked about in certain interviews how he really wanted to build upon his own anxiety of being at sea, and I thought this specific visual approach really did aid in that. Also pertaining to the visuals on this film, and I primarily wanted to mention this because I felt like it was so poorly done on the Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons, this go around it really did feel like Mr. Howard had a firm grasp on the visual effects. So even though I had some qualms with how they were used, at least it felt like he was as in control of the digitally created imagery made in post-production as the real-life imagery captured on set, which did lend a nice visual cohesion to this film. By contrast, on a lot of big-budget films, you'll see one sort of visual style be completely thrown out the window anytime a VFX shot appears. Like how in the Da Vinci Code, the camera abruptly flying into the crypt text was so uncomplimentary to the rest of the film. But apart from those two elements, I can't really say that I was a huge fan of the rest of this film visually. And of course, I'm not saying that every Stranded at Sea film needs to be as visually gorgeous or as stylized as Life of Pi. But this film was just so one-noted in its visual style. We never once got a sense of the majesty of these creatures, or even a strong feeling of how small these men were as they were lost in this endless sea. Most of the images either feel overcrowded or robbed of life due to some very unfortunate color grading, and though it is more intentional than a lot of the modern blockbusters, In the Heart of the Sea does continue their trend of kind of cranking up that contrast to 11, or really just limiting the color palette. And we've seen this in films like Pirates of the Caribbean, Transformers, Mission Impossible, Marvel films, Star Trek, Harry Potter, and Fast and the Furious. And it wasn't just the visuals that felt so unfortunately stripped back. For me, the weakest part of this film was the script. The lead characters were just so thinly drawn, and the supporting characters were almost completely two-dimensional. And for a film that is primarily a bunch of characters sitting in a boat, kind of doing nothing, if they're not interesting and you're not invested in them, the film sinks. By contrast, on Castaway or Apollo 13, it was the fact that there was so much movement within the characters that allowed the movement outside of them to be so minimal. Or on a film like Titanic, it was because we had those moments earlier on where we invested and began to like the characters that we actually cared about what happened to them after they struck the iceberg. There was one moment in particular on this film where Chris Hemsworth's character loses something that was given to him by his wife earlier on. But because I hadn't had the time to actually invest and care about the relationship, even though it was played like it meant a lot to him, I could have cared less. But even more detracting still than the thinly drawn characters was the fact that there was just no point of view in this film. Because technically it was being narrated by the Brendan Gleeson character, who was supposed to be an older version of the Tom Holland character. But rarely were events actually seen from his point of view, and sometimes they weren't even witnessed by him at all. The film was constantly hopscotching from one character's point of view to the next, never really allowing us to invest in how one person saw the world or what they wanted from it, which at the end of the film meant we were kind of denied not only intentional or satisfying character arcs, but we were also kind of left with all these themes that were muddled and underdeveloped. So for instance, was the film about man's greed and kind of their ruthless pursuit of oil? Because one scene towards the end of the film kind of alluded to that. Or were they trying to make a statement about animal cruelty? Because there were a couple moments that it felt like they thought about going there. Or were they trying to make a statement about the importance and power of stories? Because that, along with reminding the audience that this was a true story, seemed to be the main point of all the Melville scenes. Or were they trying to make a statement about the monster within being greater than the monster without? And at the end of the day, I think the answer to all those questions is yes, they were trying to do all those things. Just for me anyways, the more themes they tried to tackle, the less grasp they seemed to have on any one of them. I will say though, I felt like the screenwriters, Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver, who I thought did a really nice job on Rise of the Planet of the Apes by reapproaching a well-known property in a way that paid homage to the original, but without being dependent upon it, did a fairly solid job doing the same thing here. I haven't read Moby Dick since high school, and I never once felt like I was missing out on something, or wasn't in the know on certain beats. When it's all said and done though, In the Heart of the Sea is not a complete disaster. Mr. Howard still knows how to craft solid performances, he knows how to capture an interesting and textured world, sometimes presenting it in a visually impactful way. But those moments or characters that are interesting in any way to inhabit them are still too few and far between, and within a week's time I would probably have completely forgotten this film. If only because on December 17th, 2015 at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, I will be watching a different film. But I will give this film a not so wholehearted 3 out of 5. Nonetheless, I would still love to know what you guys think. Did you like this film more than me? Did you like it less than me? Please comment below and let me know. Also, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love for you all to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.